Singapore, and he's the plenary speaker of today. So we will be recording the screen during his talk, so please turn off your microphones and camera so that you're not included in the video. So Dr. Lee, could you please introduce Professor Zheng whenever you're ready?
I was ready, but I was muted. Sorry about that. I'm happy to introduce Zheng Shen, who is an assistant professor at the Department of English Language and Literature at the National University of Singapore. He received his PhD from the University of Connecticut and mainly works on syntax with cross-linguistic data collected using various methods. His research topics include, but not limited to, multi-valuation, agreement with conjunction and disjunction, closest conjunct agreement, multi-dominance and right node raising, ellipsis, and acquisition of degree expressions, including superlatives and measurement phrases. So he has a wide range of interests in terms of working on various aspects of syntax and other parts of human language faculty. He also, some of you may know this website already, but he's the one who started Link Alert. So if you are interested in getting conference information, you can go to linkalert.com where which he started. I didn't know about this until today. So today, I'm happy that Zheng will be one of our plenary speaker at Asian Junior Linguistics 5, and he will talk about closest agreement in Slavic languages. Let's welcome Zheng.
Okay, so should I share the screen? I will.
Yes, please.
Share my screen. Okay. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was very nice. And it's nice to hear so many young researchers work. And I think it's a great thing. And here today, I'm going to share with you something that I've been struggling with. And hopefully you can help me out with this monster of a problem. So yeah, today's talk is going to be closest agreement in Slavic languages, linear order or hierarchical structure. So the big question I'm interested in general is whether linear order plays a role in grammar and what role does it play. We all know that in syntax, hierarchical structure plays a central role, but when it comes to the role of linear order, it's less clear. So to understand its role, we look at, or at least I look at phenomena that make reference to linear relations like precedence. So today's case study is going to be about closest agreement. What I mean by agreement, well, we see the feature dependency across structures and cross languages. For example, in English, we have this book, Zhang runs, but not where this and book are both singular and Zhang runs are both third person singular, but not this books or Zhang run, where there is a mismatch between this and book and Zhang and run. So we call this dependency agreement. And we model it basically, at least some syntacticians model it by proposing there's a controller which has a certain feature, and there's a target which does not have that feature but needs to get the feature from somebody else. So what we do is we establish a dependency between the target and the controller, and we copy the relevant feature from the controller to the target. So for example, how do we derive Zhang runs? Well, Zhang run, we start with Zhang run, and Zhang already has a third person singular feature, run does not. What we do is we establish the dependency, then we copy the third person singular feature from Zhang to runs, and we have runs. Right? Today, I'm going to focus on conjunction agreement, which is basically agreement with a conjunction, right? The and P. So here, Zhang and Mary are tall. Notice R is plural, but neither Zhang or Mary is plural. So what's going on here? Well, straightforwardly, Zhang and Mary form another phrase, namely the and P. And that and P has the plural feature, and R is agreeing with that and P. Right? And that's the simple case. Today, we're going to look at cases that is not the simple case, the weird case, right? So namely closest agreement. Closest agreement refers to cases where the agreement target seeks the linearly closest controller, right? Basically, there are two cases where the controller is to the left of the NP or to the right of the NP, but the logic is basically the same. In the left tree, we have target agreeing not with the whole conjunction, but with the closest or the left conjunct. Whereas in the right tree, the target, because it's to the right, it's agreeing with the lower but linearly closer conjunct. So C1 is the first conjunct, C2 is the second conjunct. So these kind of closest agreement has been observed in a lot of languages in a variety of constructions, including Arabic, including Dutch, Hindi, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, as well as Slovenian. Today, I'm going to focus on Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and talk about other languages towards the end of the talk. So here is some facts about BCS, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, is that they have gender in this language, and the participle shows gender agreement. So what's interesting, particularly about BCS, is that when you have a mismatching conjunction, so here all suits is in neuter and all dresses is in feminine, the participle can either show masculine agreement, which is supposed to be a resolved agreement or a default agreement in this language, or it can show agreement with the first conjunct, or it can show agreement with the last conjunct. So all of these three are fine, right? And this is the subject-verb order. In verb-subject order, the participle being in front of the conjunction, the subject, can either show masculine agreement or first conjunct agreement. But crucially, when it's verb subject, the participle cannot show agreement with the second conjunct. Okay, so that's the data that we're going to focus on today. Okay, as you can see, BCS shows a lot more options than English when it comes to agreement. So this is basically the same thing, the summary of the patterns. The target can agree with the NP as a whole. Then we have the masculine resolved agreement, or it can agree with the first conjunct. But when it comes to the second conjunct, only when the subject, the second conjunct, is very close to the target, is the closest to the target, can the target agree with C2. When it's not the closest, target cannot agree with C2. Yeah. So notice, yeah, this is exactly what I said. Right. So there are going to be two approaches of these patterns. One where linear order will play an important role. The other, linear order plays absolutely zero role. I'm going to introduce these two approaches, and I'm going to argue, well, I'm going to show you an argument for the linear approach. Then I'm going to show you an argument for the nonlinear approach. And but I won't be solving the problem which one is better. I'll leave that problem to you. Right? Okay, so the linear approach proposed by Bhatt and Wako, as well as Marushi et al. 2015, assumes these operations. Basically, the process of agreement has two operations. One is establishing the link. The other is actually copying the feature. So the agree link is establishing the dependency, and agree copy is actually copying the feature. The agree link only cares about hierarchy because it happens in narrow syntax, whereas agree copy can happen in narrow syntax, but it can also be postponed to a later stage of the derivation, namely PF. So here is the model. So you have agree link always in narrow syntax. You can, in some cases, in most normal agreement cases, do agreement copy in narrow syntax. If for some reason that you cannot do the agree copy in narrow syntax, you can postpone it to PF either before or after linearization. Okay. So here's a simple example. So let's say there is an NP with matching features. Because C1 and C2 are both feminine, the NP will have the feminine feature as well. And in ICULINC will establish the dependency between part and NP, and the feature of NP will be copied onto the participle. Okay. So what Marušić working with Slovenian proposed and BCS proposed is that there are basically 3 grammars when it comes to these agreement patterns. The first grammar is when there is a mismatch between the first and the second conjunct, we actually don't have a feature in the NP precisely because of this mismatch, right? And when that happens, first grammar can do a masculine insertion. So basically you insert a masculine as a default feature, right? Then everything goes on the same way, right? So the participle will ICULINC with the NP, and the masculine plural feature will be copied onto the participant. And that's how we get resolved agreement. And then in the PF, you linearize the hierarchical structure into a linear string, but we have the resolved agreement pattern. And this is just showing the same thing can happen when it's subject-verb order. Basically, it's exactly the same thing. They have another grammar, which is instead of inserting a masculine when it does not have, the NP does not have the feature because of the mismatch, you can postpone the feature copy, the agree copy, to PF, right? In PF, what you can do is you can look into the NP and copy the highest conjunct feature. So here, the participle copies the feature of C1 in PF. Yeah. Then it gets the feature which is feminine. And that's how we get participle C1 agreement in verb subject order. Okay. So that's really like a highest conjunct or a closest conjunct agreement. The third grammar is there is still no insertion of masculine. You enter PF, you do linearization first, then you can copy the closest conjunct, copy the feature from the closest conjunct onto the participle. So here, really linear order plays a role because you first do the linearization, then the agreement copy can refer to the linear order and get the closest conjunct feature. And this is to show that the other order also works in that C2 can agree with, the participle can agree with C2 because after linearization, C2 is the closest conjunct. Right? So that's the analysis of the linear approach. Notice that the closest conjunct agreement is due to linear order. So in the analysis, to account for the seemingly linear order, they really put linear order inside the analysis. And how do we account for the badness of second conjunct agreement when the verb comes before the subject? Well, because it's not the closest linearly, right, after linearization. Right. So that's the first approach. In this approach, linear order does play a role in grammar. The second approach is nonlinear approach. As the name suggested, they are going to propose an account where even though you have seemingly linear order, linear effect, you don't have to make reference to the concept closest in your analysis. And this is by Murphy and Bushkar 2018. So hierarchical structure only, no linear order involved whatsoever. So instead of linear order, what they propose is that when we're constructing a sentence, starting from the end head, there are 3 operations. There is the merge of the conjuncts to the end head, and there is upward degree and downward degree. And the crucial proposal from them is that the order of these 3 operations are free. So all 6 orders are possible. And there are 2 cycles of agreement essentially within the AND-P, where AND will agree up and down, getting features from the first and the second conjunct, and between the subject, the conjunction P, and the verb, and the participle. So there are 2 cycles. We're gonna do these upward, downward agreement twice, right? Once inside the AND-P, the other times outside the AND-P. And the order of up and downward agreement is the same in both cycles within one derivation. So if within the AND-P you first upward agree, then downward agree, then outside, in the same sentence outside AND-P, you need to upward agree, then downward agree as well. You can't mismatch the orders of operation. And another assumption is that upward movement, which makes the subject moving to the front of the participle, is driven purely by upward agree. I'll show you how this works exactly, right? So let's take merge before upward agree and then downward agree. Right? So first of all, we have the merge, which means the C1 and C2 will merge with the AND head, which happened here. Then we have upward agree. So AND head agrees upward with C1. Then we have downward agree, which is AND head agreeing with C2. And because C1 and C2 have different features, namely one feminine and one neuter, in this language, they have a resolution rule, which means that if there is a mismatch, you resolve to masculine. So at this point, the AND-P will have the masculine feature, which projects to the AND-P. The AND head will have the masculine feature, which projects to AND-P. And outside, at this point, we're outside the AND-P. You merge the participle with AND-P. Then you agree upward first, because within cycle 1, you agreed upward first. But there is nothing there, right? So it is at this point that the AND-P is triggered to move to the specifier of part P to satisfy this upward agree, right? And because part P moved the AND-P and agreed with it, the participle will get the feature of the AND-P. In this case, it's the masculine plural, okay? And this is how they derive, using another order, how to derive the closest conjunct agreement with verb subject order. Right, so this order is first you agree downward, then you do merge, then agree upward. Because, so again, we start with AND head. Because there's, when the downward agree happened, merge hasn't happened yet. So there is really only AND head there. When you agree down, nothing will happen. It will fail, but that's okay. The second step is you merge the conjuncts, right? Then the third step is you agree upward. Notice here, when AND agree upward, it will get the same feature as the first conjunct, right? And that's the end of first cycle because you already did downward agree, right? Which means the AND head will have the feature of the first conjunct, then it gets projected onto the AND-P. So the whole AND-P will only have the feature of the first conjunct. And now the participle is merged with AND-P. It agrees down to AND-P, gets the feature of AND-P, but on the surface, it's as if the participle is agreeing with the first conjunct, right? That's the closest conjunct agreement in this analysis. Notice I did closest conjunct agreement without mentioning whether something is closer or without mentioning linear order. All these things only made reference to hierarchical order, the highest, upward, and downward, right? And interestingly, or to me at least initially surprisingly, is that these 6 possible orders will generate exactly all the attested patterns in BCS and none of the unattested patterns in BCS. So why don't we have C2 agreement when it's verb subject? Well, because none of these orders will generate that pattern, right? So we can actually, right, look at the nonlinear approach this way, in that the linear effect is accounted for without referring to the linear order, and the C2 agreement with VS is accounted for, right? Just purely using hierarchical relations. Right? So now we have one data set, one pattern, but two approaches. And both of these approaches are empirically adequate to account for these patterns, as I just have shown. I hope everything was more or less clear. Right. So here I will present one argument for the nonlinear approach and one argument against it. Yeah. Okay. So first, the argument for nonlinear approach. So in BCS, which is a great language because it allows a lot of things that other languages don't. We all know that in many languages, there is a ban on extraction of a conjunct, right? So that's called CSC, the coordinate structure constraint. So what did Marco buy and movies is bad because you extracted movies what out of a conjunction phrase. But in BCS, this sentence is okay, right? You can actually say books is Marco and movies bought, meaning Marco bought books and movies. I'll label this movement as the CSCV, namely the CSC violating movement. Right? It turns out that the agreement patterns with sentences with CSCV can tease apart these two approaches of closest conjunct agreement. So let's look at the prediction from these two approaches. The prediction from the linear approach, notice here is a reminder of what linear approach is that there are three grammars, and the C2 agreement is bad because it's not the highest or the closest conjunct, right? But now notice what we did here. We moved C1 away, right? So now let's look at what happens to these grammars. The grammar 1 says when there is a mismatch, we insert a masculine. Well, we still insert a masculine here, and it's predicting that the participle agrees with the NP, which is inserted with a masculine, should be able to show masculine agreement. Right? That's grammar 1. Grammar 2 is the agree copy, look for the highest conjunct. Right. So if we assume that the highest conjunct is the trace of the C1, we can still predict that C1 agreement can occur. Crucially, look at grammar 3. Right. Grammar 3 is where the linear order plays a role. Right. So after linearization, the participle agree with the closest conjunct. But notice here, when we move the C2 away, C1 away, C2 will become on the surface the closest conjunct, right? So it's actually predicting that C2 agreement should be possible as the closest conjunct agreement. So with this movement, the linear approach actually predicts 3 kinds of agreement, not just 2 that we saw, right? So it predicts that C1 and C2 and masculine agreement. Right, that's the prediction. Now let's look at the nonlinear approach. Right, the nonlinear approach. Here's how we do a CSCV movement in a nonlinear approach, which essentially is that when the participle probes up, it triggers the subject to its specifier position. Right, that's how we get SV. But in BCS, you can either move the NP or move the first conjunct, right? You can either probe the NP or the first conjunct, right? The CSCV movement is when you only move the first conjunct. So when the participle probe up, you move the first conjunct and you agree with it because that's the DP that you moved, right? So this will actually predict that the participle can only agree with C1 because that's the thing that moved, right? There are 3 orders that can generate this pattern, and all of these 3 orders generate only C1 agreement, right? C2 or masculine agreement are predicted to be not available. So exactly the opposite of the previous approach, the nonlinear approach actually predicts reduced options when it comes to CSDV agreement. Right. Now, these predictions can tease these two approaches apart. Let's look at the fact. Right. I asked 7 speakers, native speakers of BCS on a 7-point scale to rate the following sentences. The 29 shows the no CSDV movement. Right. All of these sentences are a VS. Right. The 29A shows the highest conjunct or the closest conjunct agreement, and the rate is near perfect, 6.9. And 29 is when it's masculine agreement, so it's agreeing with the resolved agreement, which is 4, which is also okay. Whereas the C2 agreement is bad, as described in the previous research. Now let's look at what happens when we move the first conjunct away. The first conjunct agreement, the agreement with C1, is still pretty good. Interestingly, the masculine agreement, which is the resolved agreement, become really bad. And the C2 agreement is still really bad, right? Here, as you can see, when I moved C1 away, only C1 agreement stayed strong, but both the other options are bad. Okay? If you still remember the predictions that we just laid out, this pattern supports the nonlinear approach. Right, the nonlinear approach only predicts that C1 agreement is the only option, whereas the linear approach predicts that all of these 3 should be good, contrary to the fact. So that's the argument for the nonlinear approach. Okay. Now you may ask, right? If you look at 30, you may ask, maybe, at least this is what I asked myself when I saw these facts. Maybe it has a really simple explanation, which is, so if we look at this sentence, all suits are yesterday sold and all dresses, right? You have this and here, right? And let's say there is a really on the surface ban that bans the agreement between the participle and whatever comes after the and, because there is like just a linear blocking thing, right? So we just don't agree with whatever comes after it, right? And that can explain why 30 is the way it is without teasing these two approaches apart, right? So I present to you a case which I believe takes this possibility away, which is when we have 3 conjuncts. So we can, in 32 and 33, we have sentences, yesterday are sold dresses, suits, and skirts. Yeah. As you can see, without movement, the pattern is the same as the two two conjunct conjunction. First conjunct, masculine resolved agreement, and not the second conjunct, right? When we move the first conjunct away, right, what we have is dresses are yesterday sold, suits, and skirts. Notice here, even though suits and sold are really close to each other, and there is no and in between, we still cannot agree with between the participle and the second conjunct with the first conjunct moved away. The rating is still 1.1. Yeah? And that rules out the possibility I just mentioned where and blocks the agreement. Okay, so that's my argument for nonlinear approach. So which approach is better? Well, it seems that with this new data, the nonlinear approach is more empirically adequate, right? Now comes with an argument for the linear approach and against the nonlinear approach. So to discuss this argument, I need to introduce another construction, which is called right note raising, or RNR. These constructions are probably universal across all languages. Sentences like John likes but Mary hates apples, right? And it's on the surface, it looks like the object apples is shared by 2 sentences because the meaning is John likes apples but Mary hates apples. Right? So I will propose, or I will follow the multi-dominance analysis for right-node raising, at least the relevant cases that I'll show you, which literally involves structural sharing. So to derive John likes and Mary hates apples, we have apples that has two mothers. One is the T bar in the second conjunct, the other is the T bar in the first conjunct. So it has two sisters, one is hates, one is likes. So the apples is multi-dominated, right? Or structurally shared, okay? So let's take that as a given for right-node raising. Things get interesting when you put an agreement target in the shared element, right? And here's what I mean. So this is a Dutch sentence. I'll read it in English. Anna claims that we never, but Stephen said that you often bought spoiled meat. Okay. Again, this is a case where it's the VP bought spoiled meat that is shared by two larger sentences. So the meaning is Anna claims that we never bought spoiled meat, but Stephen said that you often bought spoiled meat. Yeah. And notice here that in the shared VP, the agreement target have agrees with the second subject, not with the first subject we. Okay. So this is the second case of closest conjunct agreement or closest agreement that is in right-node raising construction. And this pattern has been observed in many languages. So this is Hindi Urdu from Batan Wako 2013, where they have object gender agreement. So what we have is Ramesh a box and Rita a small bag lift, right? Where lift agree with the object. But here, because the lift is shared in two sentences, it can only agree with the second object, the object in the second clause, not the first clause. Again, closest conjunct agreement. And in some of my work in my dissertation, I noticed that even in English within NP, we can have a shared noun. So 10 tall and 1 short student came from the US. The student here, even though it's shared by 10 tall and 1 short 2 DPs, when there is a mismatch, shows the agreement with the second numeral, right? Not with the first one, even though I'm talking about 11 students, right? So again, it's closest conjunct agreement with right-node raising, in right-node raising. So this is essentially what's happening. This tree is kind of complex, and it's probably more complex than it should be, but I've labeled the important parts, so I think we're fine. So here the T head is shared, is multi-dominated, and it's simultaneously agreeing with the second subject and with the first subject, and yet it shows agreement with the second subject, right? That's the structure. Okay. So there are several properties of closest conjunct agreement in right-node raising that should be noticed. First of all, is unlike the previous case that I showed you with a conjunction phrase, the controller DPs here, we and you, the first person plural and second person singular, do not form an NP. They're in their own clauses. It's the clauses that are forming the NP, right? The second one is that the T is not outside the NP, it's within the NP, right? Notice the NP is the whole utterance. And the target never agree with the NP, well, because it's inside the NP, right? So there is no such thing as the T agreeing with the NP in this construction, unlike the previous one, right? So here's how the linear approach and the nonlinear approach analysis account for this pattern. In linear approach, it's quite straightforward, right? So notice the three grammars. So here is the structure again, but notice the three grammar. The first grammar is agreeing with the and P right before, but here there is no and P to agree with, so the first grammar does not even come into play. The second grammar, right, is agree link between two subject and the T. The mismatch features will postpone the evaluation of T to PF. Then we enter PF. And the second grammar should be the T will find the highest subject to agree with. But notice here, there is no height relationship between these two subjects, neither of them segments the other. So we can't actually decide which subject is higher. So grammar 2 is also out of the question. What's crucial is grammar 3. Grammar 3 does the same thing. You agree link with the two subjects. The matching features will postpone the evaluation to PF. You first do linearization. Then after linearization, of course, the second subject will be the closer one to the T, and you just agree with the second one. Notice here, the linear order is crucial because things happen after linear. Only after linearization can you distinguish these two subjects. That's why linear order works so well in this approach to account for right-node raising. Now, what about nonlinear order approach? Right. Well, the nonlinear order approach, remember, it involves the ordering of three operations. It's the merge, it's the upward degree, it's the downward degree. Right. So first, let's look at cycle 1, which is within the and P. Well, since there is no and P where these subjects form an and P, the cycle 1 just does not apply here. Now let's look at cycle 2. Cycle 2 is between the subject and the T, right? So since both of these subjects are before the shared T, right? The T would agree upward first, right? But notice that when the T agree upwards in both of these cases, right? The subject moves up, agree with this, and this subject, the first subject also moves up, agreeing with T, right? So there is still no way of solving this why there is closer cis-conjunct agreement pattern allowed without referring to the linear order in this approach, right? Because again, these subjects are in the same height relations. Neither of them are higher, so we can't distinguish them. If we can't distinguish them in this analysis, it's really hard to rule in the second conjunct agreement without ruling also in the first conjunct agreement. Yeah. So that's the shape of the argument against the nonlinear approach. Right. So now enters which one is better. Well, based on what I just told you in the past 10 minutes rather than 20 minutes, the linear approach can account for CCA in right-node raising with no further stipulations, right? Which means the linear approach can actually account for two kinds of closest conjunct agreements. One is the one that I introduced in the BCS. The other is these cross-linguistic patterns in right-node raising. Whereas the nonlinear approach encounters difficulties. Right? I also have a more enriched nonlinear approach, but I can show that it still fails to generate these relevant patterns. So now comes to the end of my presentation. Where are we now, right? The CSCV movement plus closest conjunct agreement in BCS argues for one, the right-node raising argues for the other, right? I'm not giving you like a food for thought or anything. This is really where I got stuck, right? One piece of argument argues the other way, one way, the other argument argues the other way. So here's what I can think of, a possible solution, which is not ideal because potentially we want one account for many patterns, it's possible that the closest conjunct agreement we observed with ANP in BCS and the closest conjunct agreement we observed in right-note raising should not be analyzed in the same way, right? Maybe they're just two different phenomena, even on the surface, they're so similar, right? So an obvious way, so then the question is which one is right for which, right? So an obvious way of dividing the pie is that the nonlinear approach for CCA, right? The nonlinear approach for CCA is the right approach for the BCS pattern, whereas the linear approach for CCA is the right approach for raising, right? But then we have to admit that the closest conjunct agreement cannot be just one phenomenon. But I guess that's the world that we find ourselves living in. Thank you very much. That is my talk.
So thank you very much, Professor Zheng, for your talk and giving us the opportunities to think about those issues. So now we will go into the Q&A session. So if you have a question about Zheng Sensei's talk, please ask using the raise hand function. Morimoto sensei, お願いします.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm still taking in all the information, but so I might be missing a lot. But I thought that the last point that you made, the easiest way to show that is if you could look at the both phenomena in one language. So is it possible for you to look at in BCS both phenomena?
Yes, as far as I know, the closest conjunct agreement pattern in right-note raising in BCS is the same. Is that we also observe CCA in right-note raising in BCS. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's actually a quite widespread. There is only a couple of languages like Russian and maybe I think Bulgarian that does not show that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Micho, do you mind unmute yourself? And then, yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Zheng. So I wanted to ask you to sort of speculate a little bit on sort of a broader context for this work, and as a way to maybe get you to articulate that, I was wondering if you could talk about or speculate on how children learn this, right? So, and I guess part of what I'm getting at is, what are we actually learning here, right? So you showed us these very complex patterns, which are really remarkable, but I don't know how often children, for example, would be hearing structures like this. And maybe, that's an answerable question, but also is part of the conversation, part of the work you're doing, what happens when people try to produce things that they don't exactly have enough knowledge of, and yet they somehow, speakers of a single language still end up targeting the same behavior, right? So that's interesting, right? The results aren't random. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that space of questions.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a hard one. So obviously, I mean, just starting with, I'll just talk about what I think as I'm thinking it, right? How do children learn this? Well, and how I guess, yeah. So with the CCA in random raising, it's possible to come up with a story that is not part of, at least not part of core grammar, where I mean, if it's linear order, we can come up with possibly a story with working memory, right? I actually have some very preliminary experimental data from German comparing closest conjunct agreement with disjunction subject in German versus closest conjunct agreement with in right-hand raising, right? And there it seems that it shows that closest conjunct agreement is better in right-hand raising than with disjoint subjects, which indicates, so here's what I think it indicates, is that if you need to have these patterns where you have two subjects and one verb coming later to agree with it, right? It's possible that the closest conjunct agreement in right-hand raising involves a sufficient distance between the first conjunct and the agreement target so that we can forget about the first conjunct without causing a punishment. And that's what we see here in CCA in right-hand raising, right? Whereas when you agree with, let's say, John or Mary, right? The distance between these two conjuncts is too close for the verb to forget about one thing and remember the second thing, right? So the entire right-hand raising, the closest conjunct agreement in right-hand raising could be that, right? Of course, more data, much more data, or more evidence needs to be established, right? So in that way, we don't have to acquire CCA in right-hand raising, right? It comes for free. It's not even grammar. It's just, it happened to grammar, but not about grammar, right? Whereas the Slovenian pattern, that really is puzzling because precisely because the data where the C1 moved away, and you have this surprising pattern that you don't have more options, you have less options, and that's kind of surprising. And I think some sort of work needs to be done with respect to look at what children actually get from their data. Because, I mean, in a language where you can agree with the first and the second and the resolved agreement in like the most normal with no movement case, they must be able to do that as opposed to English, right? Which may indicate that the input is probably different, right? The ratio of conjunction agreement versus the ratio of conjunction agreement with different patterns is different from that language and English, and that's how they learned it. But the question is, what did they learn, right? What is the knowledge, the structure of knowledge that they learned, such that when you move one thing away, it shows this pattern. So far, it seems that the nonlinear approach is what they learned, right? For some reason, they learned not only to distinguish upward and downward agreements, but also to know that all of these orders are possible. And in English, maybe they only learned like one order or something, right? That, I mean, it's a big step from the primarily linguistic data to the rule ordering. But I mean, I think the first step is to look at the actual input. But thanks for the question. That's a huge question that we're all trying to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Fleming, do you have a question?
Hello? Oh, sorry. Hello?
Yeah.
You can hear me, right? Okay, I had a just a small question. If you go to page 28, I think it is, you have that one sentence at the end in English that says 10 tall and 1 short student came from the US.
Yeah.
And my reading of that, just based on my own intuition, is that I mean, like semantically, this is a perfectly acceptable sentence, and I understand how its use is similar to the examples you provided in, I believe, Dutch and Hindi, right? However, kind of one of the pragmatic things that stands out to me is that this, in the beginning where you have 10 tall and 1 short student, there's sort of, I guess, a focus is placed on this secondary subject here, this one short student, right? That stands out pragmatically in this phrase, and I would assume that this is intentional. This is an intentional effect of, you know, what the speaker is intending to communicate. And so I was wondering, based on my interpretation of that sentence, whether if you go back a few pages to the BCS examples, whether that is a sort of covert pragmatic effect of that's also present in BCS. So let me be a little more specific if I can find one. Because on, let me see, what page? Right, if I go to page, all the way back to page 5, there's 3 examples that you provide. One in which the verb sold takes the male conjugation, the neutral conjugation, the feminine one. And I'm wondering if that has a similar pragmatic effect as in English, singling out this one short student, if that is sort of a similar pragmatic effect in PCS, and if there's something to be said, something more to be said about that, and how it affects possibly the underlying syntax.
Right. So can you repeat the Slavic the BCS sentence you're referring to? Is that 7C?
I'm on page 5 and I'm looking at 7A, B, and C. I'm just comparing how you can take the different endings to refer to the different specific parts of the noun phrase in those phrases, right? You can use the male one to refer to the whole noun phrase, the neutral one to refer to suits, and the feminine one to refer to dresses. And I'm wondering if that has the similar pragmatic effect of singling out a specific part of the noun phrase or the noun phrase as a whole.
Right. Okay. Thanks for the question. That's an interesting question that I have not thought about, right? I don't know, but I'll be surprised that, so I will be surprised if it does. As far as I can tell from the literature, not being a native speaker, these 3 are pretty equivalent. And this is, in that sense, it's not that surprising, since that these genders are not natural genders, but grammatical genders, right? So there's nothing neutral about suits. There's nothing, well, okay, maybe the dress and feminine thing, I don't know, maybe it's stereotype, but there are other cases where so there are other cases where you just don't have this but that's an empirical question that I need to check. If that's the case, so you're talking about what can we do these agreements do these agreement patterns have some pragmatic effect regarding, right?
I guess my broader question.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, which may lead, maybe this is not your intention, but may lead to that the possibility of the first and the second conjunct agreement comes from, well, I want to emphasize the first, or I want to emphasize the second, right? That really makes 8C to be surprising, right? The bad thing to be surprising, right? Because why, if I could do it in 7C, why can't I do it in 8C, where I just, you know, really put a stress on, or I really emphasize on dresses, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So now that you've said that, what kind of comes to mind is that there is, I mean, potentially there is some sort of pragmatic effect of singling out the part of the noun phrase that you're referring to, but there could also be a sort of a blocking occurring where at some point in this process, the syntax has to stand up and say, actually, you know, this part of the noun phrase is too far removed. I have to cut you off there. You can't refer to addresses all the way later in the sentence. So I mean, there could be sort of like an interface between the two.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
It's definitely possible. I think what you're suggesting is adding a factor, basically looking at A, B, and C, adding a factor to account for the distinction between the good among the good ones.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But yeah.
Because so that basically that's exactly what I'm asking, and the reason for that obviously is kind of born out of my intuition as an English speaker when you made that connection to the English phrase you gave, because I feel there is a very, you know, pragmatic, practical reason for making such a construction that I would wonder why then in BCS can you have all of these acceptable constructions? Are they truly neutral, or is there some practical reason why you would select one over the other? So I'm wondering if, you know, there's an interface there. I don't know. It's maybe something to consider.
So let me engage with the intuition about the English here, right? So 10 tall and 1 short student came from the US, and here you're saying you're putting like some prominence on 1 short student. I wonder if that has anything to do with the difference between these two numbers. What about 2 tall and 1 short student came from the US?
How do you mean difference between these numbers?
So
would I say it if it was 10 students and just a single short student, or 2 and 1?
Exactly, right? So I was wondering the effect that you're mentioning, you're putting the 1 short student out, right? Whether that has something to do with it's 10 versus 1, right? So the ratio is 10 versus 1 rather than, let's say, 2 versus 1, which is not that different, right? Not that different.
In my immediate judgment, I would say, and any other English speakers who want to contribute are welcome to, but my immediate judgment would say that it's not dependent on the number specifically, but on the pragmatic reason for wanting to mention that in comparison to these whatever number of tall students, there is a single short one.
Okay, I see. Okay.
I'm sorry, my dog's barking. I don't know if you can hear that, but
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, does anyone have other questions? Yes, Dr. Lee.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I'm just, it's a little comment rather than like a big thing about the theory or the alternatives you mentioned here. As you're probably aware of, Bantu languages have a rich agreeing system, but the languages don't seem to be necessarily identical in terms of showing the agreement pattern when it comes to conjoined mismatched object or subject. So maybe we had one student who did a work during the about Zulu in the object cases, and she found a strong animacy effect, and and then when there was a mismatch, they would default on a particular noun class instead of actually choosing one of them or crashing. And I guess that's what you've shown in page 5 with the VSC cases where the noun and the nominal neuter and feminine is agreeing with the masculine, neither neuter and feminine cases. So other languages may be able to actually show you a little bit more interesting factors into this phenomenon. So just having a little comment on that, because they have a lot of agreement in number and gender.
Yep, thanks for that comment. Yes, I am indeed looking at other languages as well, and so there is like this huge project by Nevins and colleagues from UCL where they compare Slavic and Bantu. I think it's ongoing, but I'll keep that in mind and look at what's that in mind. The problem, of course, is that I don't know any Bantu speakers, but I do know these speakers, and you can, for example, in 37, it's really hard to look at these sentences without a native speaker, without the resource of native speakers, since they are so weird and long and hard to process. But yes.
I just suggest I can introduce you to many.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, please.
So-
Introduce me to as many Bantu speakers as possible, as I know exactly 0 of them.
Yes, because I work in South Africa, I can probably arrange some.
That'll be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay, so does anyone have another question?
I just noticed that. Oh, Yukki, do you mind if I read your comment, because I think it's a good one. You mentioned it to me privately, so yes, okay. Yukki, her judgment is that if you say one short and one tall, then the contrast is not as noticeable. And I agree with this. If you say one short and one tall, there is definitely, you're making a consideration to the numbers that you're mentioning, and there's definitely less of a, I guess, less gravity to that difference there than there would be if you were to say 10 of so-and-so and 1 of so-and-so.
Right. So yes, but, of course, unfortunately, you also took away the mismatch. I think those two things are linked, right? So it's because of the mismatch that one of them stands out, right? And of course, if you say 1 tall and 10 short, it must be students. It can't be student, right? So
1 tall and 10 short students, yeah.
Yeah, it's just there's no way of generating 1 tall and 10 short student. So in my dissertation, I look at this and that, right? This tall and that short student, this and that student, the tall and the short student, and so I also look at these tall and these tall and that short student versus this tall and those short students, right? They're all, of course, closest conjunct agreement, but I don't yeah, I need to think more about the pragmatic effect. It's not entirely obvious to me.
Do you mind saying that what you just said one more time, the this and those?
Yeah, so these tall, this tall and those short students.
Yeah. And the other way around.
And that short student.
I see.
Yeah.
I feel like that also contributes. I feel like there's also a pragmatic. Well, we can talk about it later, but there's some other aspect that's introduced in that specific construction.
I think the interesting thing is, the interesting case is to tease apart the mismatch and the pragmatic effect. But it seems that these things always, at least for now, always co-varies, which is really hard to, to conclude things from it, right? Thanks.
Okay, so thank you for the profound, very profound discussions. So if there is no more questions, we will go into the breakout session. So you can ask more in the breakout rooms if you come up with questions later. So now we will
stop the recording now.
Yes.